Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, this episode we are talking with Asher Nagy. Asher is a local Orange County tech consultant, and he is the founder and CEO of a new app called Bashars, a Jewish dating app that is now on the market. In this episode, we talk about the proliferation of dating apps, technology, social media, and how all of that intersects with the Jewish community. You know, we're truly at a time where technology, and especially social media and dating apps, has become such a part of the dominant culture, whether for us or our children or grandchildren, that it really brings up and surfaces some really fundamental questions about how to both contain and harness the power that we know social media and technology has for the good in the Jewish community. This podcast is brought to you by Congregation B'nai Tzedek in Fountain Valley. They are now offering a 12-week virtual introduction to Judaism class taught by their very own Rabbi Young. The class will be every Monday from 6 to 8 p.m. beginning March 7th. If you are curious about Judaism or just want a refresher course taught by an amazing teacher, this is the class for you. Call 714-963-4611 to register or for more information. That's 714-963-4611. Congregation B'nai Tzedek, where you matter. And now I bring you Asher Nagy. I am here with Asher Nagy, CEO of Bashar. Asher, welcome to J Life with Daniel.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
So you've designed this new dating app called Bashar. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So Bashar in Yiddish means one's soulmate. And essentially, the name Bashar gets to the root of what the app is and who it's meant to serve. So Bashar is a Jewish dating app that is particular to the Jewish community. And that means that its features also are particular and, sort of focus on the Jewish experience. One particular feature that I could call out, that shows this is we put your denomination, your Shabbat observance, your Kashrut observance on a spectrum. As someone in the Jewish community, I know that one's observance level or denomination level isn't a binary. I'm not Orthodox or conservative or Reform. I might be somewhere in between. I might be, like liberal, modern Orthodox or something along those lines.
Yeah, so I'm definitely no expert in terms of the wider dating apps, but I have heard, just from the grapevine that other dating apps really do try to force people into binaries. I know that I've talked past on the podcast about how the whole idea of Reform, conservative, Orthodox, I think both in the Ashkenazi community, it's falling a little bit apart. We can then, of course, look to the non-Ashkenazi community that, of course, never was sectioned off into the various factions. So I do really appreciate the fact that there's sort of a wider spectrum. I guess what other features do you think are quote unquote uniquely Jewish about Bashar?
My personal favorite is something that we call Jewish geography. And this is actually going to be released in the next couple of weeks at the recording time of this podcast, is essentially we allow you to play Jewish geography, which is to say, allow you to see who you know in common with your friends and your matches. So essentially you can say, we both have this certain person in our contacts, or we both went to this certain camp. And then you can start a conversation with your match around how you both know that person. And hopefully that sparks a more meaningful conversation. And this is something that happens all the time in the real world. So really, we're trying to take those organic experiences that always happen in the real world and bring them into the digital world, into Bashar.
Yeah, so this has been, I think, one of the most interesting stories vis-a-vis both the Jewish community and I think just society in the world in general over the last 2 years. Of course, we're talking now, it's about halfway through February. So we're just at the 2-year mark into when COVID-19 basically disrupted all of our lives. And we all basically started spending a lot more time online. And I think that's really begged the question of how quote unquote real or organic or meaningful of an experience can one actually have over the internet. I'm wondering, taking a step back, whether or not you want to reflect through the lens of Bashar or through just the wider lens of the internet, social media, Zoom, however you're conceptualizing this, do you think meaningful and authentic connections can happen over the internet?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think that, definitely meaningful connections can happen over the internet. And I think that the example that I like to give is essentially, high holiday services for many people were online over the past 2 years, and they had a religious experience and it was meaningful to them. And I think that that's all good and well. But personally, my theory is that digital experiences cannot replace in-person physical experiences as much as we might like to, right? A digital native, person, a person who grew up on smartphones, I think a lot of the times might even believe that it can. But I think that we're going to discover over time that you really do need to still be in person, whether it be for dating, whether it be for Jewish experiences, such as shul going or synagogue going. I think that it's really important that people still get out and meet people, because it speaks to something very fundamental to our humanness.
Yeah. So if you would have asked me about 2.5 years ago about the ability to create authentic meaning and authentic connections over the internet, I would have basically said, no chance, never going to happen. Over the last 2 years, I've been fortunate enough, both through Hillel and through Temple Beth Tikva and through a whole other range of institutions that I'm involved with, to really meet people and create deep connections online. That said, I still agree with you that I think something is lacking if we are only siloed to the online world. And I think especially for younger people, I think we're starting to get some of the preliminary data out, both in terms of what social distancing and sort of quote unquote Zoom life has done for especially teenagers. Also, on the same vein, we've started to see increased discussion in the last couple of years about social media and what social media does to especially young people, but really everybody, including, the detriment to mental health, the reduced happiness, rising rates of anxiety. I wonder if you can just reflect on that a little bit.
Well, I actually have a question for you, Daniel. I mean, in your experience, you said that you saw people engaging profoundly over online experiences. I wonder, have you seen a decrease over time in the number of people who are engaging, let's say at your Temple Beth Tikva? Do you see fewer people coming, or do you see more people coming? So my question really is, in terms of trends, do we think that it's sustainable to keep people online?
Yeah, it's one of those really interesting things that I think synagogues across the board, especially non-Orthodox synagogues that are continuously live streaming and having a online component, even while they're back in person, they're in a hybrid situation. I think it's a really interesting trend. So what we're seeing is, I think actually overall engagement has gone up, because there are so many Jews throughout the country who don't live walking or driving distance to a synagogue, or for whatever reason, they might not like the synagogue in their neighborhood. And so for whatever reason, the fact that now I can sit there on any given Shabbat morning, and if I want to, I can probably pop in online to over 1,000 services that are happening across the world. I think that there are a lot of people that are taking advantage of that community and finally saying, I'm going to find the synagogue and Jewish community that exactly fits my flavor, my personality, for other reasons. Now, I do think on the flip side, we're having a bit of an issue with going back into person. And that, I think, is an issue both in terms of the wider synagogue world, right? It's certainly true in the non-Orthodox world. It's also true in the Orthodox world. And listen, it's also true in terms of students. I know that UC Irvine just decided 2 weeks ago to go back in person. And I know that they've been doing some polls, and I'm pretty sure that the student newspaper did a poll, and there's still a wider percentage of students who are saying that they would rather stay online. And when you really start to dig into the numbers, most of it is not because of fear of COVID, but it's because life is simply quote unquote easier when I can just wake up late in the morning, 2 minutes before I have to be anywhere, I just flip open my computer. Now, I think that there's going to be long-term detrimental effects there. So the way that I like to think about it, and I've started to use this metaphor a lot, if every single night I eat an entire tub of ice cream before I go to sleep, that's going to feel really good on a day-to-day basis. After about a year, I'm probably going to look back and think that was a terrible idea. And I think that the continued desire to have everything be online, when average screen time, I mean, I can just tell you, during the pinnacle of social distancing, I was easily spending 10 to 12 hours online per day. And at the end of those days, it really does something to your psyche. Even if everything that I'm doing is enjoyable and I'm really engaged in the conversation, there is something different when you don't have that face-to-face personal connection.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And when you that poll that the UCI paper put out, I think is pretty astounding. And my immediate reaction is exactly the same as you. Is maybe in the short term, people think that's what they want, but I don't know whether that truly is good for them. And again, this is not to say that I think that technology is bad and that being online is bad. I think that it provides a lot of really great benefits. However, I think that it doesn't provide the same satisfaction and development opportunities that being in person does, right? Whether technology can come to serve these needs remains to be seen, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of the metaverse, extended reality. We'll see whether that pans out, but I think that we'll have to closely evaluate that based on psychological studies as well, because I'm not convinced necessarily at this point that that'll serve people's psyches well either.
Yeah, so moving on a little bit, one of the things that I think innovation has done, both over the course of Jewish history and also, of course, over modernity, is that it usually fills a problem or a gap in society. There's a tinge of irony here talking about the potential detriments of social media while you have just designed a quote unquote social media dating app. So I'm wondering if you can just reflect on that a little bit. Does the designing of a new Jewish dating app mean that you think you have some ethical product that can actually be better than quote unquote the normal pathologies that we see throughout other social media apps? Is this just an admission that like, hey, listen, if you can't stop them, join them? How do you sort of see Bashar fitting into the wider ethical debate about continued social media use?
Yeah, listen, I think social media has proven over the course of the last couple of years to be pretty detrimental. And I think that it didn't necessarily start out that way. I think that, for example, early Facebook seems to have been more healthy. I'm not saying it was completely healthy, but it was more healthy. People posting about themselves, their families, life updates, and slowly over the course of the past couple of years or the past decade, it seemed to have gotten worse and worse. And then you've had new applications like Instagram, TikTok, again, that start to modularize, componentize, bite-size different pieces of content, and again, using whatever growth hacking they use, whatever algorithms, whatever again, growth hacks, so like the colors that they use, right? There are so many things that a technology company can do through A/B testing, through close testing of their products and finding out what people like better. You can sort of start to get more and more addictive and make it more and more unhealthy. Some of those unhealthy aspects are byproducts, right? They didn't mean necessarily to make Facebook more divisive, or maybe they did. Some of the time, it's just it actually is intentional, and they really do mean to make it more unhealthy because it gets more engagement, right? It's all in the business model. So bringing it back to Bashar, I think that Bashar is uniquely positioned as something that's a little bit more healthy, right? One of the really unique things is that we only give you 3 candidates a day, and those 3 candidates it's meant to serve 2 purposes. The first purpose is in the Jewish community, right? We don't necessarily prioritize just looking at someone's picture and swiping on it like you might do on a more traditional dating app, hookup app. So we only give you 3 so that you can actually concentrate on those 3. And you're not allowed to swipe on these 3. You actually have to go into their profile, spend a little bit of time on it, and then choose. And the second thing is, going back to your point, is it's a little bit more ethical to not have these things, these sticky features like swiping, that are causing people to spend more and more time on dating apps, and honestly, probably hurting the way that they look at dating in the long term.
Yeah, one of, I think, the most interesting things, one of my majors in undergrad was cognitive psychology. And I remember one of the studies that I think made the most sense about the contemporary world is this idea of choice paralysis. And what ends up happening is, say, I'll give a very rudimentary example, right? You go to the supermarket because you need some new toothpaste or some new body wash, and all of a sudden there are 18 different brands that are all equally priced, and as far as you know, probably equally good. So you, of course, just pick one at random, or maybe you do some preliminary research and end up picking one. And actually, statistically, you are going to be less happy with your final purchase than if I would have gone into the same store and there was just any one toothpaste on sale. And I wonder if society writ large, because of social media, not just dating apps, but we could think of watching, quote unquote, living vicariously through influencers on social media, seeing people have vacations, seeing people sort of portrayed in the best possible light, which of course everybody tries to do on social media, is making everybody else less happy with their own lives. And it's totally a sham, of course, because I think that behind the neat facade that any of us puts on social media, people all have their own issues, right? Nobody is living this happy dream state life. I know that this is especially a problem among younger people, people who grew up with technology quite literally in their pocket. But I wonder what the conversation moving forward on social media writ large in society is going to be. Once again, this podcast is brought to you by Congregation B'nai Tzedek in Fountain Valley. They are now offering a 12-week virtual Introduction to Judaism class taught by their very own Rabbi Young. The class will be every Monday from 6 to 8, beginning March 7th. If you or someone you know is curious about Judaism or simply want a refresher course taught by an amazing teacher, this is the class for you. Call 714-963-4611. B'nai Tzedek, where you matter.
Yeah, I think that is definitely an issue that dating apps present, right? I think that giving people more options doesn't necessarily make you more happy, exactly as you've said. I don't want to, push any fake news here, but I did see someone post an article.
There will never be any fake news on the J Life with Daniel podcast.
So maybe I shouldn't even cite this article, but I saw an article that was saying that people who get married younger actually end up have a lower rate of divorce. So people who get married younger without having cohabitated with their significant other before getting married. So A younger, B haven't cohabitated, actually end up having a lower divorce rate. And I think that is an interesting point or data point in favor of what you just said. I think that there are definitely arguments to be made on the other side, but maybe the data doesn't bear that out. Maybe, finding out what living with this person really is like isn't the best option. I don't know, but it's definitely, fascinating to see that as one of the points in favor of what you're saying. Going back to the question of social media in general, I think that there's not really a possibility that social media will go away. Social media is an entrenched part of our day-to-day lives at this point. And people who grew up with it really are, it's part and parcel of their lives. I don't think we can take it away from them. And I don't think it would be good to take it away from them, because there are healthy things that come out of social media as well. I think a record number of people are now creative. They're part of this creator economy, and they've created, whether it be merchandise or content that is actually really beneficial. So I don't think that we need to get rid of that. I think that it really is around how do we make using social media more healthy. And I think that there are a lot of efforts and a lot of startups that are working on that exact problem, whether it be around how do we change the business model, right? So one interesting point that you may or may not know about is that there's this new concept called Web3, which is essentially giving, to really oversimplify it, is giving users ownership over their own data so that platforms like Facebook can't necessarily use their ad-based business model that's caused them to, put more and more into data collection and keeping people on the platform and causing divisiveness. So giving people their data back is one approach out of many. I think Bashar is taking a different approach. We're just trying to make the app a little bit less sticky. We're trying to, make people spend a little bit less time on it, but still make it very meaningful and engaging.
Yeah, this is also, somewhat of a paradox, because right now there is a massive, I hate to use this term, but a competition for people's attention, right? People only have a finite attention span, right? And people only have a finite number of hours in the day, and any time spent on one platform, whether we think of it as an online platform or an in-person platform, be it Hillel, be it a synagogue, be it just any other thing that one could imagine spending their time doing, there's sort of this zero-sum game going on. And I think that that's a really interesting dynamic. And we're seeing that actually being built into the models of, I think, a lot of social media apps, where they're specifically trying to make things as sticky as possible. One thing that I think is somewhat jarring is when they've actually done a whole host of neurological studies, they found out that what keeps people attentive for the longest is actually being in a slight state of being pissed off, right? So if somebody's really happy and they're scrolling through Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, sure, they might see a couple happy things, they see a few happy pictures, and then after 5 minutes, they turn it off and go make dinner. If somebody's really, really upset, right? Say you're scrolling through Facebook and just the whole thing is just anti-Semitic propaganda, or the whole thing is just politics that are the exact opposite of everything you believe. Maybe you get really upset and you're like, I don't know why I need to read this. The middle point of showing somebody just enough that they have a tinge of unhappiness, but enough things to sort of keep them on this emotional roller coaster where they're constantly happy, sad, very much the same way we can imagine, right, a slot machine that really hijacks your system, where you always think that next really interesting thing is coming, or that next thing that's going to make me happy is coming. I think this is a real question in terms of social media use, right? It brings up these big picture questions of whether or not we want social media to be regulated, who we even trust to regulate that. So I think that there's a whole bunch of interesting conversations to be had here.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I don't have the answers to what to do about big tech and technology in general, but I think that it's really interesting to think about the ability to what you call hijack our human function, our brain functions, because technology is going to continue to be able to do this. Maybe we should regulate it, maybe we shouldn't, but another way of approaching it is maybe we can figure out ways of using these things that we've discovered, that these technology companies have discovered, to do good. So maybe there's a way to help ourselves by continuing to use these hijacking functions, if you can call them that.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously the Jewish community has moved a long way from when people used to show up at the well. If we look through the book of Genesis and Exodus of how, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe met their significant others, right? It was obviously just showing up to the town well and meeting them, right? So we've obviously evolved a great bit towards that. One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I think that this is one of the unique factors of where we're at currently in the Jewish community, is sort of this time where I think a lot of people find themselves in Jewish institutional limbo, right? We can imagine the time where you graduate college, but before you have a family, which one could imagine sometime in the mid 20th century was a lot shorter, right? When the average age of marriage really in America in general was in your early 20s. Now it's in your early 30s. So now one of the things that I think the Jewish community has been slowly reacting to, and they certainly have reacted in a myriad of positive ways, is what do we do with a 22-year-old who is obviously too old for any college events, but too young, not actually too young, but they feel like they're too young to join synagogue or more institutional Jewish life. And it seems like an app like Bashar, I'd be curious to sort of hear the numbers, but I would imagine an app like Bashar is significantly skewed towards that populace of people who aren't organically meeting each other at their campus Hillel or campus Chabad, or even just in a Jewish studies class, and not people who are necessarily meeting at Kiddush at Shul, but specifically that middle ground where people are craving Jewish community, but simply don't know what's out there.
Yeah. So first, just a funny point is that we actually considered calling Bashar by the well. It was a close second in terms of what name we would choose. But I totally agree. And in fact, the numbers do bear out exactly what you're saying. Our largest segment is probably between the ages of 21 and 27, roughly. And I think that the wider Jewish community definitely is recognizing that this is a really underserved demographic, whether it be the explosion of Moishe House or the OU's new initiative called Yavne Bayit, which is meant to also serve, this post-college pre-marriage graduate, a young adult. And listen, I think that Bashar is a good way of serving them, but I firmly believe, as I've said multiple times, that we should not rely on online experiences. So if Bashar, and we have considered this idea, and hopefully in the future we get to this, if Bashar can become a community that doesn't just exist online, but is sort of bi-directional, exists online and in the community, and we create community events. I think that would be really healthy, because people are looking for meaningful experience after college, right? They go from this really intense experience where they're in close contact in many cases with fellow Jews for 4 years, And then all of a sudden, nothing. They have no institution that sort of oversees their Jewish engagement unless they join a synagogue, which seems to be, not always likely. So yeah, I think that this is a really important problem to address, and we definitely do want to address it in the future.
Yeah, and this is something that I think actually the Jewish community is really moving towards, I think, in terms of increased engagement, not only for these people that are in this limbo period in their 20s, but I think really people that are familyless or single. I think for a whole host of reasons, traditionally, if you think of the mechanics of a Jewish institution, they are very family centric. And I think really the Jewish community is starting to realize, for a whole variety of reasons, some societal, some individual, right, some generational, right, a lot of people just aren't looking yet or ever for that family life. And it'll be really interesting to see how the Jewish community responds to that. Can we create programming where people can come and get involved in the community, even if they don't have that family component to it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I definitely think there's a societal component, right? Just, general Americans get married later. I wonder if there's a financial aspect to it as well. I think that being a Jew is really expensive, especially being an Orthodox Jew. I think that for a lot of Orthodox Jews, the idea of sending their kids to day school, which costs, sometimes, in the tens of thousands of dollars, is really, really difficult. And people don't want to have kids and necessarily get married until they're financially sound. So I think that's another problem that I know people have been working on that one for many, many years. But I think that it's continuing to get worse and worse.
Sure. Yeah. So moving in one final direction, I know we only have a couple of minutes here. One of the things that I think the Jewish community in the last 25, 30 years has really mobilized towards, and this is much more of a descriptive statement than a proscriptive statement, is when the data came out about intermarriage in the 80s and the 90s, the Jewish community basically had a communal freakout that intermarriage rates were so high, and subsequently cultivated a whole series of programs, right? We could think birthright's probably the most well-known, specifically with the implicit and sometimes actually explicit goal of getting Jews to marry more Jews, right? I think that there's two different ways to view this problem. And so I wanted to sort of tease them out and, bounce some thoughts off of you. On the one hand, I think that if we view intermarriage through the realm of it being a problem, which I know is already somewhat of a controversial idea, but let's take for a premise, we think it's a problem, right? Again, descriptive, not proscriptive. I think intermarriage could very much be seen as a symptom, not a root cause, right? If people are actively engaged in the Jewish community and able to organically meet other young Jews, statistically, the rates will dampen. Now, that doesn't mean every single person, of course, right? That's not the way the statistics works, nor does it mean people who don't marry Jews are doing something bad or evil, right? I don't want to be misquoted as saying that, but just in terms of a strictly Jewish establishment data point of view, right? There's a big question of whether or not intermarriage is a root, quote unquote, cause of assimilation, or if it's more a product of assimilation. I'm wondering if you can reflect on that also vis-a-vis Bashar. Is the goal of Bashar, or is one of the goals of Bashar to have more Jews marry Jews? Is it just a convenient platform for Jews who want to marry other Jews if they can find someone?
Yeah, I also respect everybody's decision, but I think that there is some inherent, benefit to having Jews marry other Jews in only because I think that the data bears out that, 2 generations later, you will have people who are who you won't have as much assimilation if a Jew marries another Jew. So I do think that Bashar does serve that purpose a little. That wasn't our intention when we started Bashar. We're happy to contribute to that cause and hopefully perpetuate the Jewish people, Jewish culture, Jewish values for future generations. But I wouldn't say that it was necessarily our goal when we started Bashar.
Sure, yeah. And we also have to name that, probably one of the things I hear more than anything else in the realm of dating, and I hear this both from people that are looking to date and also of the parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles of people looking to date, is that it's actually really hard to find young Jews. I mean, especially we both live in Orange County, right? There's a robust Jewish community. I think there's 100,000 Jews here, but don't quote me on that number. I just, recent statistics that I was reading, right? That's not that many, right? If you're not engaged in any specific Jewish community and you've gone to public school and you've gone to one of the universities here and you get a job and maybe you play, I don't know, softball every Sunday morning, right? Like the chances to organically meet another Jewish person are just really tough. And of course, we can't necessarily hold that against anybody for any decisions that they make. The question that I'm more looking towards, and it seems like you've already answered this question in some ways in the affirmative, but there are so many people that in their mind, they would want to be able to find somebody who's Jewish, and at that moment, they're just not available. It seems like Bashar is just a really good tool for people in that situation.
Yeah, and I think that another benefit, and this is for Jewish dating in general, I think that some people have a hard time going outside of their social networks, right? We have in the Jewish world, the idea of a shadchan, or the idea of someone who sort of, sets you up with their friends. And I think that Bashar sort of helps get into that mold of thinking where you're not going to date one of your friends or someone that you know from shul. It's someone who's outside of your community. It's someone who you might not have met otherwise, right? And I think that whether it be cross friend group or cross geography, I think that's something that's really important, and is a big benefit of dating apps, is that it changes the frame of reference, the size of the group that you can look at. And so I think that is a really, really good thing that's happening in terms of Jewish dating apps and dating apps in general.
Yeah, and just one final reflection here about just general intersection between the Jewish community and Jewish engagement and social media, whether we think about dating apps or TikTok in general, is that it really seems like social media is creating all across the board just a more intense experience. And I think that intensity can both be seen in some ways positive and in some ways negative. I know that more young Jews than ever are engaged in actual Jewish content, right? Deep Jewish learning through short Instagram or TikTok videos. I mean, just this week, I was watching this Instagram of Miriam Anzovin. She is a Jewish educator that lives in Boston who's been creating daily Daf Yomi reactions that are these 45-second bite-sized reactions to the Talmud that are both clever, funny, and also deeply traditional, also breaking the mold of what traditional Talmud study looks like. And I know that there's hundreds of similar things going out there. On the same time, we know that social media has been a cesspool of anti-Semitism, right? We could specifically think about what happened during the Israel-Gaza war last May in terms of just the utter proliferation of anti-Semitism that all Jewish accounts, individual Jews who wanted to say anything positive about Israel were seeing. And it seems like there's really this duality to social media. And I think it's a very Jewish perspective to some extent, because I think that Jewish tradition at its root, we're not categorically against anything except for maybe idolatry, right? And I think that's a whole separate issue, right? Maybe we'll do another podcast about specifically why idolatry is sort of seen as the root evil. But in terms of almost anything else one can imagine engaging with, Judaism is not categorically against something, but we are very particular of ensuring that we have things in the right places or the right time, and that we're not just saying, oh, we're going to take this whole thing without trying to modulate it somehow. And so just in your final reflections, I'm wondering, if any part of that is, provocative or inspiring to you.
Yeah, I actually am curious to hear your thoughts on something, not to redirect. There's this concept that you just brought up of really bite-sized small pieces of content that are really engaging and intense, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are, long shurim or, learning experiences where you have to deeply engage with something, really break your head against it and wrap your mind around it. Do you think that as a general rule, we should be pushing more towards maintaining something of we're going to really engage with this? Or do you think that we should sort of surrender to these intense small experiences?
Listen, there is no substitute, in my opinion, for deep learning where one is attentive to an idea or a concept for more than 60 seconds, right? I think even if we conceptualize the traditional Jewish model of learning, right, it's two people sitting across from each other at a table with Talmuds open, basically yelling at each other for hours on time within deep concentration within whatever topic that they're learning. And so I think that as a society, we're going to lose something if everything moves to the 30 to 60 second bite size, or 240 characters on Twitter. That said, of course, I'm a realist, right? This stuff is here to stay, right? Hopefully it doesn't become so ubiquitous that people's attention span is reduced to 45 seconds. But while this stuff is already here, I think that the Jewish community has and will continue to make an effort to ensure that there's at least some positive content, right? If somebody's going to be scrolling TikTok for an hour every night, I would rather them see some funny and clever video that's kind of talking about a page of Talmud or a Jewish concept from the weekly Parsha than just watching 100 different dances.
Right. But I think that it begs the question, because the more that we engage with small bite-sized content, the more that we are unable to go back to that learning. I think that the research now shows, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but there was a book, I think, in the about 10 years ago called The Shallows, that showed that human brains are actually changing, and we're unable to do this deep, meaningful thinking the more that we engage with internet content. So I'm not sure that it's actually possible to have this view of, we can do this and this. Maybe it's we have to push for one or accept and surrender to the other. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think we could say a lot of things about Judaism, and I think one of them is that Judaism's always maintained sort of an idealistic view of what the future can look like, right? We can think about this in terms of metaphysical terms or even physical terms, right? And so I think, again, call me foolishly optimistic. I do think that we really have to. I mean, this isn't even something that wouldn't it be nice if we could figure out how to do this, right? Social media is so ubiquitous, especially for people who grew up with it in their pockets, that if we don't find a way to ensure some sort of deep learning and authentic connections and all these things through social media, I think we're really going to have a problem. I mean, the average amount of time that people under the age of 20 spend on social media a day is astounding. I mean, it's 6 to 8 hours, and that's just on various social media apps, YouTube, things like that. People are quite literally walking around with headphones in their ears all day. There's always content playing. And so the question is, that's already happening, right? I don't think having a stance where we try to sort of erect metaphorical walls and keep that out, I just don't think that's going to work, because again, this stuff is so pervasive. And once it's there, it's really hard to go back. And so unless we want to advocate for some top-down governmental solution, which I don't think would work anyway.
Which China has done, by the way.
Yeah, no, of course, China has done. And I think that this is, again, one of the bigger questions that I think liberal democracies are wrestling with, across the board. And of course, I am very pro liberal democracy, so I don't want to be.
Same here. I don't agree with
there. But yeah, but again, if we leave it to every individual at every second to have full autonomy over what they do with their time, and we also leave social media apps unregulated, harnessing the power of AI, harnessing the power of thousands of neuroscientists, literal neuroscientists that are employed by Facebook and Google and TikTok and all of these companies that sit around all day and do nothing but try to figure out how to know Asher's brain as much as possible to keep you engaged on social media apps. I think we have a serious problem, because you might think you have free will, right? I'm almost thinking of, God hardening Pharaoh's heart, right? I'm sure if you would have asked Pharaoh, he would have said, yeah, of course I have free will, right? I'm deciding to do this. But we know, right, from the Torah, it says that God came down and hardened Pharaoh's heart, right? He had no choice. Social media is almost becoming that, where I can tell you with myself, I'll get home from a long day of work and I'll want to sit down, and my goal will be to write an article or something like that, or prepare a class for the next day. And I'll sit there and I won't even know what happened. And
You'll see the little red circle. Yeah. Right. With the numbers in it.
Yeah, no, it's astounding. I'll see the little red circle, and then, you get some dopamine hit, and I say, oh my God, this, and this is all happening unconsciously. And next thing I know, I'm 5 minutes into scrolling throughout Instagram, and I'm watching some video of a giraffe, and I'm thinking, how the heck did I end up here? Right? I can't even trace my attentive thoughts back to it. And so I think we're really getting to a dangerous point in society where we're going to have to figure this out.
Right. And again, this goes back to the point that I made earlier, which is totally agree that this is here to stay. And I think it's on the next generation of, technology leaders. But increasingly, I think it's going to be the intersection between Jewish leaders and technology leaders. So Jewish technology leaders to come up with the ways in which we're going to harness this power for good, and create Jewish learning experiences that are truly engaging to the modern mind. And so I think that's the positive thought that maybe we can leave it off with, is that I think that there is a lot of potential for the future. I just think that it's going to take an increasing amount of intersection between technology and Jewish thought to come up with the right solutions for the person in the modern world.
Amen. So if people want to know more about Bashar, how can they download it? How can they find it?
Yeah, so Bashar can be found on either the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. The spelling is Basheret. So Bashar, and then you can find our website at basheret.app.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Daniel.